Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. I'm joined by Susan Geyer at the NACIS Loeb School of Communications and an all-star panel of experts on today's topic, accessing immigration records. Before I provide brief introductions on our panelists, a quick word about my organization, NEFAC, for those unfamiliar with the work that we do. Our coalition is the region's leading advocate for First Amendment freedoms and the public's right to know about government. Among many other services, we provide programs like this one on timely topics that help journalists and curious community members throughout New England. I encourage you all to visit nefac.org and check out our upcoming events, including a 30-minute skills lesson on immigration reporting later this summer. Susan, why don't you tell us a bit about your great work at the NACIS Loeb School?
Yeah, thank you, Justin, and welcome everybody. And a special welcome to our panelists. I appreciate everyone coming out today. And I'm really happy that the Loeb School is able to partner with Justin and his organization to bring you this today. The Loeb School is a private nonprofit based in New Hampshire, and our mission is to promote and defend the First Amendment and foster interest, integrity, and excellence in journalism and other forms of communication. And we do that by doing things like this panel today, as well as offering free or very low cost classes and trainings and workshops throughout the year and other initiatives that support local journalism, the First Amendment, and right to know. So, Justin, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, now let's turn to our guests. Joining us today are Ellen Goodrich and Renee Griffin at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. The Reporters Committee recently released an immigration reporting legal guide that covers topics such as accessing legal proceedings and covering immigration enforcement. You can find that guide and other resources at rcfp.org. Thank you, Renee and Ellen, for being here. Also with us is Jason Leopold, a senior investigative reporter at Bloomberg and a leading, perhaps the leading expert on accessing government documents through the Federal Freedom of Information Act. He also publishes a weekly newsletter called FOIA Files, and you can sign up at bloomberg.com/account/newsletters/FOIA-files. We'll put that in the chat. We'll also put it in the notes to the recording when we post it. All of that's there. Highly encourage everybody to subscribe to Jason's newsletter. Thank you for being here, Jason. And
Pleasure.
Also with us, thanks, Jason. And also with us is Lau Guzman. Lau is a reporter at New Hampshire Public Radio, and she covers immigrant communities, housing, education, and health. Big thank you to all of you again for being here. Before we begin the discussion, a reminder to everyone joining us that you can use the Q&A button to submit questions at any time to our panelists, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. I also want to encourage everyone here to use the chat to introduce yourselves and to contribute to the conversation with your own advice, guidance, and resources as we move forward. And I've seen some of you have already done so. So thank you. All right, let's begin. Lau, I would like to start with you. I'd like to have you begin the conversation talking a little bit about your experience as a local reporter. There seems to be no shortage of stories about ICE and local police activities that are largely conducted in secret. So please set the scene for us. Describe what you're seeing in the communities that you cover and the challenges that you've experienced trying to get records helpful to that reporting.
Yeah, no, it is super tough, right? I think the ongoing joke is that ICE doesn't respond to my emails. Whenever you write a story, you're like, oh, I'll send in a comment to ICE just so you can type in the story. ICE has declined to respond for a comment for the story, whatever you put in. But usually we get wind because somebody in the community tells us. Like, for instance, there was a story about this guy called Arnold Marquez, and that story was broken by Stephen Porter at the Globe. And this made national news. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, but it was a story about this man he had a DUI, he showed up to his court date, and then ICE agents just tackled him in the lobby while he was going to his courthouse appointment. And we wouldn't have known about that if it hadn't happened in a public space. So we got wind of it because of the great reporting over at the Globe. And we went through all the court documents because those are already public, right? You just just check Pacer and, these are already public. And then we were able to get the guy's address. So that happened back in April. So I just drove down to this guy's address. I met his cats, I met his roommates, and we just had a conversation about hey, this guy's gone. What does this mean for you? And they decided that they didn't want to bring more attention to themselves. So that story ended up never making it to the air. But if these actions aren't happening in public or like in ways that that other people are telling us about them, it's just like almost very impossible. And I mean, that's kind of the whole reason we're gathered here today, right? Like the importance for me as a local reporter, like I want people to know what's happening in their communities, what's happening in their courthouse, their neighborhoods, that sort of thing. And I think like that's kind of one of the difficulties that we're facing here is just that the enforcement arm of immigrations is totally non-transparent to the public and to us as reporters. So yeah, I'd be curious what other folks make of this question.
So we'll get to a little later in the discussion about ways that we can get around those challenges and access information, particularly records, despite what's going on. But first, Jason, tell us what's going on at the federal level. Most of your work involves the Federal Freedom of Information Act. You're relying on federal agencies to give you information. What are things like lately?
They're pretty bad. It's not great. You know, the public record sort of atmosphere on the federal level has been bad for a really, really long time. And this predates Trump. It goes, you could go all the way back to, George W. Bush, but it's way worse now. And the reason why it's so bad right now is because you have agency FOIA offices that have been caught up in the purge of federal workers. It doesn't mean, in some agencies, obviously there's no one left to process records. But at DHS, where you have ICE, CBP, and other divisions that would kind of fall into the kind of records people would want to gather to sort of scrutinize the immigration policy and what's happening on the ground. It doesn't mean that you're not able to get records, but it just means that you have to take a radically different approach for how you obtain records. And I want to note that at DHS, the head of the FOIA office there, which again oversees ICE, oversees CBP, is a former litigator at the Heritage Foundation. Right, this is his name's Roman Jankowski. He was one who blanketed agencies with tens of thousands of FOIA requests and then went and sued. So the assumption would be like, or is, or was, or has been that he's in there, he's going to block everyone's efforts from getting records. It's partially true. If you file requests for any records in 2025, and I've learned this from, some of the folks inside the agencies, for ICE records or CBP records, you're going to be faced, or you won't even know it, with you're not going to receive any records from 2025 because they have been told to reduce their backlog from prior years, beginning with 2018, before they even get to 2025. So I see that as a complete violation. But I also want to note that what's happening, because this, what's been happening on the ground has been moving, where ICE is showing up in communities, and it's been moving so quickly where reporters will, and watchdog groups will just immediately file requests to the agency asking for records. What the different approach that I mentioned, what it requires is really drilling down on exactly what you want and approaching the records requests in the exact same way you would approach a news story, by spending a week or 2 weeks sourcing up and finding out exactly the kind of record that exists as it pertains to the subject matter of what you're, investigating. And I feel that I could say this with experience, that once you get a request and that is just so targeted, the FOIA officers are much more inclined to process and release it quickly because it's, exactly what you want, what kind of record is there. It just means that it takes extra effort for us as reporters to investigate that. So you have to build the FOIA into the news gathering process at the front end. And firing off a request is just not the way to do it anymore at the federal level.
Right. So Jason, thank you for that. And I'm going to get back to you in a few moments for some more guidance, particularly when it comes to crafting those requests, making sure that they're narrow enough to get the information that you're looking for. But let's first take a step back and go to you, Renee and Ellen. Perhaps you can share with us a little bit about what the law looks like, what laws we're dealing with on the state and local level as opposed to the federal level, what those laws require. And then tell us a bit about some of the inquiries you've been getting at the Reporters Committee from journalists who are having either a difficult time navigating those laws or finding that those laws aren't being followed at all.
Sure. So for the state level, unfortunately, every state looks a little bit different. So it's kind of hard to speak with just total, like every state does this. But for the federal level, you're working with 5 USC 552. Basically, it requires that an agency responds to your FOIA request within 20 business days. But as Jason was saying, they rarely meet that timeline, if ever. But there's a whole host of federal agencies that you can submit a records request to. ICE, USCIS, CBP. So like Jason said, I feel like a big tip is making sure you know which agency you need to be submitting your records request to. Sometimes they'll be like, hey, sorry, you've sent it to the wrong person. We forwarded it to ICE. Say you send it to CBP. They don't have to do that, and a lot of the times they won't. So just make sure, as Jason was saying, you're doing the research on the front end. And then another key thing about the federal FOIA are the exemptions that'll be raised. So some popular ones in the immigration context, exemption 6, which is personal privacy. So if, for example, you were requesting someone's A file, which is all of their immigration documents, you're likely not going to be able to get a lot of that information unless you have a privacy waiver from the individual whose file you are seeking. So just being aware of that, or in your request, making it clear, like, I'm not seeking any personally identifying information, and getting ahead of that. Another big one is exemption 5. Part of that is what's called the deliberative process privilege. So basically communications between federal employees about a policy that's not yet adopted is going to be exempt under FOIA. So if you were looking for internal discussions, sometimes those can be more difficult to get. But just knowing kind of the contours of that and what is actually required can be helpful. We have a FOIA wiki. If you just Google FOIA wiki, it has a really strong breakdown of all the exemptions and case law that has to go with the exemptions. And then the last one, big one, I think, is probably exemption 7, which is the law enforcement exemption. So if you were trying to get details about like an ICE raid or something and the strategy that law enforcement used to then go and do that raid, that might be difficult to get. So I think just being aware of the possible exemptions before going and actually making that request and finding a way to frame your request to kind of handle the potential exemptions that can be raised can be a good tip. And yeah, and also request at the state and federal level. A lot of local law enforcement agencies are working alongside the federal agencies. So they both likely have some sort of record. So you can kind of double dip and both request it at the federal and from the state agency.
Great.
Renee,
Thank you.
yeah,
Renee, I'd like to go to you to talk about at the state and local level what kind of access we should be receiving, what challenges we have there. I should also just tell everyone all of the resources that are mentioned during this program, including the ones that Ellen just made, they will be in the notes of the recording when posted. And I would also include in that list NEFAC's own FOI guide at nefac.org/FOI guide. But Renee, bring us back to the local level. What are we seeing there as far as access concerns?
As Ellen mentioned, every state has its own public records law, and reporters should absolutely exercise their rights under those laws. It's difficult to talk about it in broad strokes across every state, and you'll run into different issues across different state agencies that respond to them. The Reporters Committee frequently assists with submitting, helping journalists submit requests to state agencies as well as federal agencies. You can feel free to reach out to our legal hotline if you need assistance on a particular request or to be directed to the right resources in that area. I did want to mention sort of a different category of records that has not come up yet, but because immigration records is sort of a broad umbrella term, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on a different kind, which is court records. As many of you likely know, immigration courts are sort of a different beast than the federal and state courts that we tend to be more familiar with from, criminal context, civil litigation. Immigration courts, in contrast, are administrative courts that are sort of controlled by the executive branch. And unfortunately, as a result of that, there is far more limited access to what is happening in those immigration courts. There are no public dockets the way that there are for federal court via PACER or most state courts. So in order to sort of monitor what's happening in immigration courts, which of course are the courts that are deciding whether a particular individual gets removed or not, overseeing asylum applications, all of those sort of nitty-gritty immigration issues. A lot of times the best tool a reporter has is to physically go to the immigration court and see how they operate. And fortunately, federal regulations do require that immigration court proceedings are presumptively open to the public and the press. There's a regulation called 8 CFR 1003.27, and all this is in our immigration reporting legal guide, so I won't get too far into the nitty-gritty of it. But that requires that immigration judges let the public and the press monitor and attend immigration proceedings, generally without, filming it or things like that. But presumptively, people are supposed to be let in the room. And that is oftentimes a really useful tool for journalists to be able to see how immigration judges are handling some of these cases and just see what kind of people are being put through removal proceedings and, see them appear at those hearings and the arguments that are being made and things like that. So that's something that can also assist in the sort of front end research that Jason and Ellen were talking about in preparing immigration public records requests. Being aware of how those cases go can be really helpful to refining your asks. A different category of court records is these immigration cases that do eventually wind up in federal courts that we're more familiar with. Often these are what are called habeas cases. These have been making headlines in the Ozturk case. The Mahmoud Khalil case are examples of these where, an individual is detained. They argue that detention is unlawful on First Amendment grounds or other constitutional grounds. And so they file a petition in federal court to be released from that allegedly unlawful detention. And so that starts up a federal case, which should be more readily available to the public, the records for that case. The challenge is there's a procedural rule that often deprives the public and the press of electronic access to court records through PACER in those federal court matters. And so sometimes you will have to physically go to the courthouse where the case is being heard in order to view a lot of the filings in that case. That said, there are some opportunities to remove those access restrictions because a lot of times even the immigrant petitioner is not in favor of, the docket being sort of hidden from the public in that sense. So, for example, the Reporters Committee just earlier this week filed a motion in the Fourth Circuit in one of these immigration habeas cases to sort of remove the access restrictions so that those filings can be available to the public as well as the parties through the electronic access portal on PACER. And so there are some opportunities for access in those federal court cases that you might not otherwise have in the immigration courts themselves.
Thanks, Renee. Can you speak a little bit more about the difference in access between the strong right of access we have to a court proceeding versus the lack of access in some cases to electronic court records and information that you might be able to go right into the courthouse and get yourself in person, but can't get online? The difference between that online access and in-person access. Are there any other examples you can think of? And if so, are there workarounds or any guidance you could provide on how to get those records nonetheless?
So in these federal court cases, it's really a little procedural rule that is not super well known that hides these that removes access on the electronic portals to the federal court filings. And so when I say federal court filings, those are the like motions and briefs that are being filed by the parties to the court, arguing that, you know, the detainee should be freed from their unlawful detention. That said, the court orders that are entered, you know, deciding the case should always be public online. So those will be accessible the second they're posted. And the other thing that's accessible the second it's posted is the docket entry, which shows like, you know, so-and-so filed this motion on this day seeking this relief. So you can see that the motion was made. You might not be able to click on the document and see exactly what it says. And that's the time when you might have to physically go to the courthouse and, you know, ask the clerk to use the public terminal, and at that point, view the documents. And if there is a particular case, an immigration related case in federal court that you're having trouble accessing, please do feel free to reach out to the Reporters Committee legal hotline, because we, as I said, have been filing, we recently filed a motion and are sort of keeping track of these instances where reporters are basically blocked from electronic access to these dockets that are of significant public interest. So there may be some legal mechanisms that you can take with the assistance of attorneys to sort of remove those access restrictions.
Jason, can you speak to this challenge a little bit more? I mean, you're a national reporter. You need access to information from many different states, but you personally, you're only in one location. So maybe you could just provide a little color here. Tell us a bit about your own personal work and challenges getting information when you can't just go online and get records that is someone, you know, working in a particular district could just walk down the street, go to a courthouse and get.
You know, as Renee was discussing this with regard to some of the court cases in the past, you know, I have, and the newsrooms I've worked for have intervened, you know, in some of those court cases. I mean, it's for just to gain access to anything that may have been sealed, or working with some, you know, other groups, other First Amendment type groups, and, you know, other localities. But, you know, for me, really, I'm, you know, trying to track down whatever information there may be, you know, available. Particularly right now, there's been a lot that's disappeared. Right. There's a lot of data sets that I've come to rely on previous years, and I'm sure others have as well, that have disappeared. So, you know, I use the kind of tools that are, you know, that are available to resurface some of that, you know, lost data. But that may not be getting to exactly what you were driving at. So I want to be sure that I'm answering the question. So do you want to sort of elaborate a bit on that, on what you were, you know,
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. And maybe this doesn't apply to you specifically, but I've heard from journalists working at national news organizations that, for example, might want information about the Tufts student who was in Vermont, detained. Court proceedings occurred in Vermont, but for all of the reasons Renee explained, many of the court documents related to that case weren't online. They weren't available in Pacer. You could certainly go to the courthouse, request them, and get access to them in person. But many of the records we're talking about regarding court cases in particular aren't online, which can make it difficult for those that are not in a particular state to access those documents and use them in their reporting. Have you encountered this, or maybe some of your colleagues?
And actually encountered it regularly with court cases. So this gets a bit old school. You know, I used to be a court reporter covering like civil courts and criminal court a really, really long time ago. When, you know, not when there was no such thing as the internet, but when it was a sort of in its infancy and courts were not posting it online. So we had, you know, we would hire, you know, court, you know, kind of a courier to go grab the documents, or work with you know, another reporter, a local reporter, to get the documents, you know, in person if it's available. I mean, to me, I totally get it, but it just, you know, I think we, you know, you have to come up with just sort of alternative, simple ways. There's still ways to get the records. We deal with that, you know, all the time, particularly in really small, you know, districts or localities, communities, where they just don't have that ability to put everything up. So it kind of means just like, I'm going to pick up the phone, I'm going to call someone or send an email to someone I know locally, pay them and, see if they can go grab those records. So I feel like, being really, really old school is something that I sometimes have to kind of look toward.
I appreciate that. Yeah, good advice. Be old school. Look for other methods to get that information. Lau, I'd like to ask you to speak now from a local perspective, because sometimes that information, it doesn't even exist. I'm getting outside the scope of court records now when talking about all local agencies, particularly law enforcement agencies, many of whom I know there have been many examples of this in Massachusetts. I assume other states as well, like New Hampshire, where police might be on the scene. They might be on the scene where an ICE detention is or other operation is taking place. You then go to that law enforcement agency, local police, and say, hey, I'd like all of these records regarding this particular operation. And oftentimes you're left with the police saying, well, ICE didn't provide that information to us, or that wasn't our operation, so we don't have any records to provide you. How does that make your job difficult, Lau? And what do you do in those situations?
Actually, I have a story, kind of going on off this like old school theme, like Jason was talking about. We had this case. I'm make a point of like hanging out in my local community, going to community block parties, just like keeping up with my sources, checking in with them every so often. So I get a tip from one of my sources, and they're like, ICE was at this, Colombian bodega down the street. And I was like, okay, I'll go check it out. I go to my Colombian bodega. I say hello to the owner. His name is John. He's a sweetheart. We start chit-chatting. He asked me how things are going, and I'm like, going well. I'm always working. How are things going for you? I heard there was an ICE raid. He was like, no, that wasn't here. And he was like, try down the street. So I go walk down a couple blocks, and there's a Dominican bodega owner, and we're chit-chatting, and I'm like, it's lunchtime. I'll get my lunch here. And so I asked her like, oh, what's happening? I heard there was a raid at the Colombian bodega. And she was like, no, it's not this one. It's the one 3 blocks down. So I walk 3 blocks down. I head to that Colombian bodega. I meet the guy that's running the bodega. He's a new guy. The bodega just changed hands. And I was like, I heard there was an ICE raid. And he was like, no, it was the sheriff. I'm like, what do you mean it was the sheriff? And he was like, yeah, it's the sheriff. So I go and I check in with the local sheriff, and it turns out that they just like got a guy that they were looking for the longest time. They had a warrant. It wasn't ICE, but like the way that these rumors spread so quickly, because everybody's so scared, like I had to like walk 4 or 5, like this took up most of my, like a random Tuesday morning. Like I'm just like trying to get all these people to trust me. And it turns out it was just like regular law and order proceedings that wasn't like nothing we'd normally cover, like nothing like completely unusual. But like, I think the problem is because these things are happening kind of behind closed doors, and people are kind of freaking out because they're seeing the social media videos of like people just like wearing masks and like vests and baseball caps, that they just like associate any kind of law enforcement with ICE activity. And it's actually very interesting because in New Hampshire, we have what we call a 287G agreement, which if you're not conversant in the like United States like citizenship code, it's USC code 8. It's this agreement that allows local police officers to take on ICE functions, and it's pretty controversial in New Hampshire. I've been kind of covering it on and off since it started in February. And one of the things that sheriffs are saying is that they want to join and take over some of these ICE functions, like, serving warrants and like helping maybe transport folks, because they want to have that trust with the local community and want to be, clearly identified law enforcement officers, with their badges and their like signs and the like cars and that sort of thing. Because I mean, like at the end of the day, I think a lot of the time it's not actually ICE we're seeing, it's actually people just confusing regular law enforcement with ICE. So I think it makes it a lot more complicated when you're trying to track these things down, when people think it's ICE, but it turns out that it's not.
All right, so you find out that it's not ICE, it's your local police department that's engaged in these operations. How have you found access to be when you go to those departments and say, provide me the records of this particular activity, this incident? Are they forthcoming? Stonewalling? What has the interaction between you and local law enforcement agencies been?
Yeah, surprisingly, they're very transparent. New Hampshire has one of the strongest, we call them right to know requests, RTKs, but they're just FOIAs. And there, you go to the clerks, you file them, they get back to you in a timely fashion. You show up at the police station or whatever, you pay your $7, you get your USB and you're golden. Like everybody's super professional. And I was expecting a lot more pushback, right? Because you like walk in looking the way that I do, and you walk into a police station and you say good morning, and you're like, hopefully they don't hassle me, but like everybody's been like super professional about this stuff, and I was expecting a lot more pushback. But I think when it gets to a local level, right, like all of our sheriffs are locally elected, like this is small things. So people kind of just get used to seeing me at community events or showing up at like, county budget hearings, this sort of thing. Or like I'll like go over and introduce myself to the sheriff at like, whatever your local touch it truck or whatever. And it's not as intimidating, I think, because I am a local reporter and we do have that relationship with the local sheriffs and the local police departments. So yeah, fortunately, that's been one place where we've been able to get a better handle on these records, as opposed to the big feds who never answer my emails.
Well, let's go to that because relationships do matter. They are important, particularly as a journalist, certainly. But there are often, occasions where we're filing a records request to some agency that we don't have a relationship with. We're filing that request cold, waiting an unreasonably long time to get a response, if any. Jason, can you tell us a little bit about your experience doing that? And I know you've been at this a long time and you have relationships, perhaps across the board, but speaking to those that don't have the types of relationships and experience you do, they're filing a federal FOIA to an agency. What is the best way to do so? How should they follow up? And what's a reasonable expectation at this point?
Sure. Well, there's what the law says, right? Which is the 20 business days where the agency has to respond. And technically they should respond with records. Never happens. Although I will say that I have received maybe 4 sets of records this year, in the quickest time frame. The record, my new record, is less than 24 hours. So I can only assume that this agency wanted these records to come out, because that never happened before. Relationships matter. Whenever I'm filing the request, I would advise anyone, if you can't file it on, via email, is that you should file it via FOIA.gov. Agencies used to have their own portals. DHS has its own portal, secure release. The reason I'm filing it on FOIA.gov, secure release may be fine, is that I've encountered agencies that have their portals have crashed, they've been taken down, they've been hacked, lots of issues. But after I'm filing, or excuse me, before I'm filing my request, and again, this is just my sort of best practices, what I do is I'm reaching out to the FOIA officer. I am saying that, I intend to file this request. And I'm doing that now because there are so many, hurdles that I would have to jump over in order to get records in a timely fashion. But I'm filing the request. Just want to give you a heads up. This is coming. Probably going to ask for expedited processing. But I also wanted to see if if it's something that if I can go over it with you, to the FOIA officer, because I don't want it to, I don't want it in a month from now, you respond and saying it's too broad, it's, broad and burdensome, or didn't adequately describe, records I'm seeking, or sent it to the wrong office. Everything I do is designed to save time and to hopefully get records quicker. And those relationships really matter. And just picking up the phone or sending an email to, the FOIA liaison goes a long way. And I do so with the, again, with the thinking that, we're just in a different time right now. Again, as I mentioned, like, there are many things that are not unique to this administration and the lack of transparency that exists here. But there's also a lot that is new, right? And so I'm trying to speed up that process, and kind of implementing these best practices, goes a long way. But at the same time, I do want to say this, that if you're filing a federal FOIA, you have to be in it for the long game. It's the long game. you can be lucky and just, ask for a single document, and maybe you get that in, a month. But don't forget, 20 business days is essentially a month. So you're already waiting a month, right? Just for an acknowledgement letter with a tracking number. But I'm kind of relentless in kind of following the path of the FOIA. And I think that it would probably serve anyone who is also filing requests on the federal level to do the same. But you do have to think of it as a long game, because the agencies are backlogged. There's tens of thousands of requests that have come in, that they've received this year, just, second quarter, first couple of quarters of this, first 2 quarters of the year. So it's only in your best interest to kind of, think of the, maybe the FOIA officers may not like it to be thought about this way, but you got to think of these folks as your sources, who can be there to help you, hopefully.
Thank you. Follow-up question for you, Jason. What is the process for following up on your requests and appealing non-responses or denials, briefly?
Sure. So, I mean, look, there are some, when I'm following up on a request, there are some agencies that just won't respond. So what I'll do is I'll ask for an estimated date of completion, and I'll cite the portion of the law that requires an agency to provide a requester with an estimated date of completion. And that's what you should, any requester should, on the federal level, you can probably do this on the local level as well, but on the federal level, I'm formally requesting an estimated date of completion for this request, citing the portion of the law that requires them to provide me that. It's just an estimated date, but it will arm you with some very important information as to know, okay, the agency is going to take a year to process this, or I'm in the complex track. What can I do to get out of that and to get the record I need on a more expedited basis? It may mean narrowing your request. You may have asked for 5 years worth of emails, may mean scoping out emails, filing a separate request. So that's what it should follow up probably after the 20 business days. The non-responsiveness, if you're reaching out and the agency's not responding at all, I mean, you could certainly appeal that as a constructive denial, and maybe you can use OGIS, the Office of Government Information Services, with due respect if anyone from OGIS is here. I mean, I just don't think that they have the teeth to kind of help requesters with getting some relief. So obviously the next step is suing, so which is something I do, and largely because you're trying to compel these agencies to release records. But if you're at a stage where there is no response, it's a constructive denial. Renee and Ellen may have, I'm sure, have some guidance, on that, on the appeal as well.
Yeah. Renee, now let's go back to you, because I do have a question regarding the interplay of local agencies and federal agencies. But before we get there, do you have any guidance regarding what Jason was talking about? Any suggestions perhaps that are in your legal guide? Anything you can provide?
Yeah, on the FOIA wiki, we have a really great page about drafting administrative appeals. I think one thing about administrative appeals is you don't need a lawyer to do them. So it's something that you can draft yourself, and if you reach out to the hotline, we can send a lot of resources to help you in drafting the administrative appeal, some examples, some helpful case law. Basically what you're doing is laying out your argument, either saying, hey, you've, given me a constructive denial because you way missed the deadline, or say you want to challenge an exemption that's been raised. Another thing about the federal FOIA is there's a thing called the foreseeable harm standard, where the agency has to show how releasing the information would actually harm a stated interest. And a lot of times they'll just be like, we have considered the harm, without actually explaining how releasing this information is directly associated with this harm, and they're required to do so. So that's another thing that you could add into an administrative appeal, and basically say you didn't meet the standard you have to show that there's harm here. So yeah, I think it's something that reporters can put together, and they can reach out to the legal hotline if they have some questions on specific cases and like specific instances. But I can send the administrative appeal page too. That would probably be helpful.
Renee, perhaps this is a question best for you, though. Lau, Jason, now feel free to jump in. Question posed here has to do with the interplay of both federal agencies and local agencies and getting records from either one. Here's the situation. As written, Alaska Department of Corrections is now holding ICE detainees from around the country. They have said to contact ICE for information on what people are charged with, criminal versus civil charges, etc. But shouldn't those local agents know what the individuals are charged with, given that they are in local custody? Have you come across this situation before, Renee? Do you have any suggestions or advice here?
I've not personally handled one of these cases, but I'm sort of aware of this issue cropping up repeatedly across the country where, you know, detention centers are often operated by local agencies, sometimes even private companies run ICE detention centers. And so it can be challenging to sort out which records the various parties should have. And if it's a private company, you know, private companies are not subject to FOIA or local public records laws. So it does sort of put another barrier up in trying to gain information about who is there, why they're there, what ICE is detaining them on the basis of. ICE should still have records about each individual detainee. And the ICE detainee locator is a tool publicly available online where you can see exactly where people are being held. And Ellen just sent an ACLU of Michigan lawsuit about basically this issue in Michigan, basically the interplay between the local Michigan public records law and sort of ICE directives to local agencies not to share specific records about detainees. And so unfortunately, there's not a simple answer, as you might be able to guess by the fact that ACLU of Michigan is actively litigating these issues. And off the top of my head, I can't say how Alaska's public records law might interact with ICE directives. But it is an issue we're seeing a lot and something that can be challengeable potentially by reporters and lawyers, but it will vary case to case.
Can I add something too, Renee?
Yes, please.
This is the ACLU of Michigan's second suit about this. They're challenging like the pattern and practice of ICE's FOIA office, to my understanding, but they've sued in the past for a 287G thing like Lau was talking about earlier, where basically they had requested records from a Michigan state prison, and this prison said, ICE said we can't give it up. The way the Michigan public records law says, or the way the Michigan public records law works, is it says if the record can't be withheld under a federal law, and 287G is just a federal regulation. So they found that they did have to release the records. So again, like if you look exactly at what the Alaska law states and how it interacts with the federal agencies, that might offer some guidance too. But just, yeah, it can really come down to exactly like how the state law is worded.
Yeah, totally. Like up here, we had something similar where we got wind that one of our only federal prison, the prison up in Berlin, it's way north, almost at Canada. We got wind from actually the LA Times and KTVU Fox 2, which is a local Fox station out in California, that they got this like leaked memo. Nobody knows who leaked it, obviously, hence leaked. That the Department of Corrections and ICE were partnering to house immigration detainees in federal prisons, right? So we got wind of this. And obviously I reached out to the Department of Corrections and they told me to reach out to ICE, which told me to reach out to the Department of Corrections. They just like had me like go around for a bit. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then the New Hampshire ACLU decided to file a FOIA because they want to know, because like famously this prison is A, understaffed, and that's a big issue across like all of our prisons here in New Hampshire. And it's understaffed, and B, it's in poor conditions. And that's what it even said in the leaked memo, that it needed like pretty significant upgrades, but we know right now, because the ACLU is litigating this, that at least one and up to 100 people are being held there, and like nobody really knows what's going on. So they have a FOIA in. Like you were saying, Jason, who knows if or when the federal government will ever get back to them. But I find that the ACLU is very transparent about releasing the documents that they have, and you know, their press person is obviously here in New Hampshire. She's very proactive about letting me know, like, oh, you know, we have this thing coming in, like, I'll let you look at it. And then the other thing I'll say about prisons, or I guess jails, in this case, is here, at least here in New Hampshire, one of the big things that we're looking at is like who's paying for detentions. And one of the stories that we've been tracking for a while here is that ICE wants to pay county jails in order to detain immigration detainees. And you know, they get paid a certain amount per day, and that's a way that at least some people are saying this is a way that we can like pay to upkeep our local jails. And that's decided at a county level. So something I've been doing is I've been spending like a lot of time at the local county commissioners meeting, because honestly, like these decisions are so local, because New Hampshire really does believe in local control, that just watching and reading through the minutes of your like local county commission is actually relevant to this like decision of whether or not your county is going to accept federal ICE detainees. So the key there is just to like show up to these meetings and then just chit chat with the clerk, because the clerk knows everything. The clerk knows everyone. The clerk runs the whole thing. So if you show up and you're nice to the clerk, then you're in. Like it's really that simple. At least on such a local level. So those are the two things that we're kind of tracking here, where we found, at least at NHPR, that the feds are not going to give us anything. But since we are a local station, since we're the local radio station here, we care about things on a more local level, and more local immigration records are kind of going to be the place to go, because the feds just aren't transparent at all.
Thank you. Question here from one of our audience members, related to news gathering, getting information from the feds. This person writes that ICE often requires an A number before releasing information, and wonders if any of you, and I'll open it up to the group, do any of you have any creative suggestions on finding someone's A number beyond family, friends, or their attorney? And if you could start off by just explaining to everyone what that A number is and how it's used.
So that's the unique identifier that the federal government gives to immigrants when they enter the country. And so it's almost, this isn't a perfect analog, but almost like a social security number, in that it's all the person's immigration related records will correspond to that A number. In terms of getting access to that A number, it is kind of a private piece of information to some degree, because having that A number then can give you access to some of the potentially sensitive information about that person's immigration case. And so I do think in a lot of cases, likely the only way to get access to that A number will be through the individual themselves or their attorneys. But if anyone has other experiences, I have not personally tried to procure A numbers of individuals before.
Yeah, sorry, I wish I had like a better, like, out of the box answer for you, but honestly, the best thing is like building trust with their attorney. And you know, showing your attorney that you're legit and that you're not going to like, that you're going to do justice to this person's story, and they're going to report it fairly, like links to previous work. Yeah, I wish I had something better for you. I'm sorry.
I've had this question pop up a couple of times, because we have a number of audience members that are outside of the US asking about federal FOIA. Federal FOIA can be used by everyone, US citizen based in US or not. Do I have that correct, Jason?
The federal FOIA is open to anyone, anywhere in the world who can file a request. On the local level, you know, state, local level, it's different. I mean, there are some states where if you are not a resident, meaning us, if we're not residents of the states, that you can't file, you know, a request. But federal, anyone can file one.
Thank you. And going back to the A number for just a moment, is there any other information, Renee, that you can get with the A number beyond the court hearing dates and location?
You know, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, that, as it's not a piece of information I regularly have at my disposal. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that, right off. I suspect you might be able to get access to their case status more broadly and potentially documents related to their case, but, you might need some other credentials through EOIR.
Thank you. And some good advice in the chat here. Ted mentions if you go to immigration court, the judge will announce the petitioner's A number at the start of their case. And in some cases, it will be listed outside the courtroom on the list of cases being heard that day. So another source to get that A number if you're seeking it. All right, excellent. I want to, as we're about to conclude here, last call for questions. If any have them, please use the Q&A button or put them right in the chat. I'd like to just hear from all of you some final words about what immigration records in particular you think have been most important to your reporting, and just to give our audience a sense as to the types of records that perhaps they could be seeking to enhance their own. And what advice or guidance you might have in addition to what was discussed already. Jason, I saw you first to unmute if you would like to begin.
Sure. Yeah, I also want to note this, that everything I said, with regard to gaining access to federal immigration records and what's happening at DHS, to underscore the point that I was making about the agency being bombarded is probably the wrong word. They're just getting a flood of requests. I don't want bombarded to sound negative, but with all that, I just wanted to point out that Customs and Border Protection has to address the deluge, they are seeking contractors just to address a surge in FOIA requests. The CBP has a backlog of about 140,000 requests, and they're looking to award a multi-million-dollar contract in September. In order to process all of these requests and deal with the backlog. So I just wanted to note something positive. What that will ultimately mean is it remains to be seen. For me, what's really been crucial in terms of these records and what I look at is what's going on behind the scenes. I'm very interested in how the Homeland Security Secretary and the department at large is kind of framing, their immigration policy, the immigration crackdown, what's happening on the streets and how they're vilifying communities through producing slick videos and taking trips to El Salvador and having photo ops. I'm very interested in what's happening behind the scenes with that. And just kind of the standard operating procedures, something as simple as, having all ICE, officers wear masks. What's the discussion that took place behind the scenes? So those are the kinds of records I, am interested in. What I would say, again, the most important takeaway, I think, for anyone that's looking to file on the federal level is do not just fire off a request. If you are not sure what kinds of records exist, there are lots and lots of lawsuits that FOIA lawsuits that you can gain access to review what others have asked for, particularly groups like ACLU, me, American Oversight, all the good government watchdog groups, even Judicial Watch. You can go onto the agency's website and see what's in their FOIA reading room. You can just spend a lot of time, even with Congressional Research Service type documents, to understand the kind of products that, these agencies on the federal level have. And who they may be communicating with. Because when you file that request, you should spend at least a couple of weeks, in my humble opinion, kind of doing that kind of research, because it's going to serve two purposes. It's going to help you get the request faster. It's going to also empower you in terms of becoming an expert on what kinds of federal records actually are out there. And it will just, serve you well down the road. So that's my guidance there. Sorry to take up too much time. But and if anyone has any questions, they can always reach out to me personally.
Thanks, Jason. That's great. In fact, one specific question for you from someone in the audience, actually a former student of mine at University of Connecticut. Kevin, great to see you here today. Kevin's early in his journalism career, wants to get in the habit of filing public records requests, federal FOIA requests. And Jason, this question for you is, given the current environment, is it better to focus on the advice that sometimes is given, just regularly file requests, maybe once a week? Or should he instead just be focusing on the quality of those requests, narrow requests, maybe relevant to a particular story, as opposed to making it a practice to send out many requests, regardless of what ultimately might be done with that information if it's received?
That's a really great question. If we were in another time, I would say keep filing, just file regular requests. I would focus on the quality of the request. You don't want to go on fishing expeditions anymore. That's not going to serve the requester community well, but it's just not going to get you what you want, and you're certainly not going to get it in a timely fashion. Focus on the quality of requests. It may get to a point where you find that you're just so well educated on what exists, what kinds of records there are, that you can file multiple requests per week or every week that are tailored to the specific records and targeted to the specific records that you want. But in short, I would say just focus on the quality right now as opposed to quantity.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate the advice. Lau, let's go to you. And in your final remarks here, if you could also please just address the challenges of reporting within your community when you have agents that are using masks, plain clothes, unmarked vehicles, which have been prevalent in a lot of ICE cases lately. We have someone in our audience who wants to know specifically, from you, how this has been challenging, and more specifically, what are some of the things that you've done to respond to those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough, right? Because it's hard to know what you don't know. And if you ask guys like, oh, I mean, I've done this a bunch of times and I've yet to hear back from any of them. I was like, oh, I was told by a source that you were here at this place on this time at this date. Can you confirm? They will not answer you. So it's kind of hard to tell. So you can check with local law enforcement, right? But they may not tell you, or the local PIO at one of the cities that I cover. I don't think she likes me very much. She usually just like obfuscates, and she's like, no police action was taken at this time. And I'm like, okay, whatever. Thank you, Heather. Always lovely to chat with you. But so I think that's a challenge, and I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer for you, Kevin, but I think the way that we're gonna get out of this one and is just to keep on going. I mean, I'm a local reporter and I care deeply about the communities that I serve. I mean, yeah, I think that's the only way. Like, you walk your beat, you show up, you take tips, you try your best, because I'm going to be the person who's going to be there, not only for this raid, but for the next one, and the one after that, and the one after that. So what you want to do is you want to create a reputation for yourself for A, being fair, and B, like not being a total jerk, which seems like a low bar, but I mean, y'all have met reporters. Some of us are kind of real jerks about this stuff sometimes. So that's something that I try to remind myself. Like, yes, you want to get the story, you want to press really hard. Yes, you want to like scoop other outlets, but at the end of the day, because we're the outlet that's going to be here, we don't want to burn any bridges, and we don't want anybody to feel like we're just like using them for their story. We want to be super respectful of this stuff because this is someone's whole life. So yeah, that's kind of my thought process. I'm like, I have to think of this not only for this story, but for the long haul. Like, how is this person going to feel about us even after I'm gone from the station? Like the next reporter that inherits the beat from me.
Thank you, Lau. Renee and Ellen, I'll get your final remarks in just a moment, but a couple questions specific to you. The first is a bit detailed, so if you'd rather punt on this or have this person follow up directly with you, feel free to say so. But they write that they recently wrote a story about a U.S. citizen who was detained by Border Patrol for documenting immigration enforcement activity. This person was told by DHS that they would be filing an investigation and that he could not leave the county for 6 months while this investigation was occurring. Ultimately, he was released, didn't receive any of the paperwork regarding this situation. And the question is, well, how would you follow up on this? How would you get records regarding the investigation that supposedly occurred into this U.S. citizen who was detained while presumably reporting what was going on at the border?
Ellen, you want to handle the public records request element of that, and then I can provide some additional color.
Sure, you could request, what agency, DHS, from DHS, any investigative records they have. If you know this individual, you're likely gonna wanna include a privacy waiver. Have them like sign a form and say that they're consenting to you getting any, information DHS has about them. I think I would need a little more specific to be able to know if this is like gonna fall within exemption 7 or if there's a chance that you'd actually get anything. But I think if you get a privacy waiver, that's gonna strengthen your ability to get something. And then Renee, you wanna take the rest?
Yeah, sure. I do think that's sort of the specific fact scenario that I would encourage you to contact our legal hotline if you want specific assistance with filing a public records request or anything like that. It does sound like a unique case and something, I was gonna briefly mention that there is generally a right to record immigration enforcement officers and other police officers doing their duty in public, assuming no obstruction or anything else with the duties they're performing. So to the extent that's a question you have, I would again urge you to reach out to our legal hotline.
One more question for you, Renee and Ellen, and Jason, allow if you have any information on this as well, feel free to add that. But we're talking about immigration records here, and this question has to do with records that are kind of indirectly related to immigration or immigration enforcement operations, particularly litigation that involves parties that have been injured during raids. Maybe they weren't the subject of the raid, they weren't detained themselves, they were just a bystander, but they were injured or harmed in some way. Are you aware of any litigation regarding those types of incidents?
Some litigation ongoing about treatment of journalists at protests related to immigration in Los Angeles at the moment. But in terms of specific litigation related to misconduct by ICE agents carrying out raids, I'm not specifically aware, but to the extent there are cases filed, I'll emphasize again that there is often access to judicial records in federal and some state courts. So if there's a specific case you're interested in, again, I'm unfortunately not aware of any just right off the top of my head here. But if there is a specific case, you should be able to learn about that case relatively easily through court records as opposed to, the sort of more drawn out public records process.
Great. Thank you. Renee, Ellen, any final words regarding this topic? Any additional resources you'd like to share?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you all were mentioning the FOIA Wiki, and the FOIA Wiki is like the greatest resource out there. I also use it often, and I wanted to make sure to plug it because it really also does help with appeals. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jason. Always happy to have a plug for the FOIA Wiki. And so, like Ellen said, we stayed a little bit high level in some of the legal nuances here, but our immigration reporting legal guide does get much more in the weeds. And to the extent you have specific questions or come across an issue where you're being blocked from accessing an immigration proceeding, or you're confused why you can't access judicial records in an immigration habeas case, I really would encourage you to reach out to us at the Reporters Committee through our legal hotline, rcfp.org/hotline, and we can try to work through your options with you.
Well, a big thank you to all of you for joining us over the last hour or so to really shed a light on a number of these immigration records related issues. A lot of great advice, guidance provided, and really grateful for everyone's time. Likewise, grateful for everyone who joined us today. We had a very large audience, a lot of people just showing their interest in this incredibly important and timely topic. I would suggest all of you again go to nfac.org as well as the websites for all of our respective organizations. Find the events that we're hosting, additional resources that can be found there. Also, before we conclude here, a big thank you to Susan and her colleagues at the NACI Loeb School. NACI Loeb School has been a longtime partner of NEFAC for many years, and Susan, very grateful for all your help and support for this program, and a big thanks to you as well. All right. Thank you all again. I appreciate it. And please keep in touch. Really appreciate all your help today. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Justin.